GitHub Actions with Chris Patterson.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host. Make sure to check out www.azuredevops.show for past episodes and show notes. We have some really great episodes lately around the time of the virtual Microsoft Build Conference and beyond. And make sure to go check out those videos from the Build Conference. Just tons of content. And that was kind of some exciting announcements that came out. If you are tuning in for the first time, the Azure DevOps Podcast is for developers who are shipping software with Microsoft technologies. And my goal for all development teams is for them to be able to move fast, deliver quality, and run their systems with confidence. And there's a lot of user groups that are having virtual events and virtual presentations and discussion over webinar technology. And I've been doing a lot of virtual speaking. If you're running a group or a part of a group and would like me to speak on .NET DevOps to your group, then book me. I think I have one every 2 to 3 weeks, it seems like, on my calendar. So reach out. I'd love to get on your group's calendar. Got an awesome guest today on the show. Chris Patterson is the staff product manager for GitHub Actions at GitHub. And Chris has been in the software industry for more than 20 years. And in that time, he's worked on a variety of projects at companies ranging from startups to telecom. And prior to coming to GitHub, he spent 14 years as a principal program manager on the Azure DevOps team at Microsoft. Chris, welcome back to the show, sir. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Jeffrey.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime. We actually, for the listeners, I think show number 15. You are very, very early number, show number 15. So, and you're at GitHub since.
I am. Yeah. So that was, I don't know, a year or 2 years ago. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, since I talked about that, when I was working on Azure pipelines, or I guess what became Azure Pipelines. I think at that time it might have still been called Visual Studio Online. Yes, I have come to GitHub. I started at GitHub, officially started at GitHub in January of this year, but actually started working on what we shipped as GitHub Actions in May of 2019. Basically, the idea was we have a lot of great technology in Azure Pipelines, and there's certainly was a lot of desire from the community for GitHub to offer a very fully fledged CI system. And so we wanted to figure out how we could do that as quickly as possible. And so we basically took part of the team, which was a big chunk of my team at Microsoft, and moved them to work on what is GitHub Actions. It's been an exciting journey. Definitely very fast ship from May to when we shipped the open beta essentially in August with a GA in November. So it's been a lot of fun.
Nice. Now, GitHub, acquired by Microsoft, but how is the separate but integrated going? Like, what kind of things do y'all talk about? How separate versus how much partnering with the teams at Microsoft actually happen? I know everybody because everybody's been working together for years and years. But what's the mantra, or what's the charge from the executives?
We're very much a separate company and a separate organization. I certainly build my own backlog, and we have our own strategy and own direction. I don't take, nobody at Microsoft tells us what to do. But we do have a close partnership. I mean, in the end, we are broadly, GitHub is a part of the overall Microsoft set of companies. And obviously, we have a lot of long-term relationships working with those people, with the members of various teams at Microsoft. But at the same time, I work very closely with people from Amazon and Google and HashiCorp as well. I have very regular meetings with all of those partners, and we do very much think about those partners on equal footing. When I work with teams at Microsoft, they don't have any particular special insight or other ways of integrating that aren't available to any other partner. And we think that's very important because GitHub needs to be that middle of the community, whether it's the open source community or the broader development community, and making sure that those developers can be as productive as they could possibly be wherever it is they're targeting their deployments or whatever other tools they're using is incredibly important.
Yeah. When Microsoft bought LinkedIn, there was a lot of questions about what would happen, but it looks like LinkedIn as well is pretty independent. I mean, we haven't seen, if it's anything like that, then it seems to work pretty well.
Yeah, it's basically, from what I understand, it's a very, very similar model. LinkedIn, I've certainly worked with people at LinkedIn as well. Actually, I worked with people at LinkedIn as part of my role at Azure DevOps, working on Azure pipelines, and I've worked with folks at LinkedIn as part of my role working on GitHub Actions. And they operate independently. They're their own engineering org, and all of those kinds of things. Overall, I think it's been great. I think that it's been super important for the culture. It's been very interesting to me that somebody that worked for a long time, going to an office basically every day, working for a company that really does drive remote as a first principle. It certainly made me learn some new things, and I think it's been good overall. There's some times when I certainly miss those very high bandwidth brainstorming type sessions that we used to have, but you find new ways of accomplishing the same things. And in general, I think one of the things that's been coolest about the working at GitHub and sort of the remote first model and the culture here is it allows for really broad diversity, actually. If you can go to and hire people where they are, versus trying to find the people where you're at, you automatically just get a different set of points of view and a broader set of, people to work with. Because, if you hire where you're at, to some degree, you end up self-selecting, for people that are very much just built in whatever area you're in.
Now, how many time zones do you work across?
Oh, I work across, I don't know, whatever, California to India, basically, is the pretty standard set of time zones I work across. Every once in a while I get, Japan or somewhere else in Asia, Australia, things like that. Not too often, but whatever, I don't know how many time zones that is. It's a lot. I think it's 14 or something.
Yeah. Ooh, okay. So, so so many people are still working from home, but is most of your team still in the Pacific time zone, or is it really just evenly distributed?
No, it's pretty evenly distributed, honestly. So we have, partly because we had a large Microsoft office, or still do have a large Microsoft office in North Carolina, which is where kind of the core of what was the TFS team way back in the day was based, or at least a big chunk of it. And that team has been here for a long time. And we took maybe a third of those developers and moved them to work on GitHub Actions. And so we have a pretty good size base here in North Carolina. And then, of course, we have teams in California, and I work with colleagues in New York and some in Cleveland and the Midwest. And, there's some up in Seattle, in Vancouver. And we also have a group, we have a couple of developers in the UK, I think one in Spain. And then in India, we have a chunk of what was part of the Azure DevOps team that was in India has also been brought into GitHub as part of the GitHub India, which was a relatively recent announcement that, if you go back and look, really starting up an office and a real first-class operation in India with a general manager and all those kinds of things.
Okay. Well, just in the last month or so, there's been GitHub Satellite, a conference, and there's been Microsoft Build, and so for maybe we start with just catching people up on what are the big announcements that have been shared recently.
Sure. So at GitHub Satellite, we talked about a couple of things related to Actions. I think probably the most interesting thing to a big chunk of the audience is going to be GitHub Actions coming to GitHub Enterprise Server. This has been one of the highest requested things since Actions even debuted a couple of years ago, and it's something we've been working incredibly hard on. And we do expect to ship a beta sort of in the second half of this year with hopefully a GA towards the end of the year. And it's coming along great. We've got some customers on the alpha already. And one of the cool things we did with GitHub Actions on GitHub Enterprise Server is we really made Actions part of the GitHub product. And what I mean by that is if you take the code base it started from, which was a .NET desktop code base that had been around for a long time that was running on VMs in Azure, that is how the service kind of still runs in production. But we took that, we migrated all of that code to .NET Core, and then got it stood up on containers running in Linux, and then made that part of the GitHub Enterprise Server install. And we wanted to do that because we didn't want anybody to have to go set up a Windows box and configure kind of this weird dual-headed monster in order to have Actions on GitHub Enterprise Server. If we had done that, we could have shipped it months ago. But we really felt it was better to take the time and make sure it was really part of this cohesive unit of management and backup and all of those kinds of things that really make the administrator's life better. But also just, we wanted to make sure it really felt more like a GitHub product and not like a Microsoft product kind of bolted onto GitHub.
Okay. So it runs in a Linux container wherever they want to put that container.
Well, the container for GitHub Enterprise Server runs, it's more shipped as part of an appliance today. I think there'll be some things in the future that'll come out that might make it a little bit more flexible as far as deployment infrastructure. But at the moment, you get this sort of appliance VM, and on that VM, there's a bunch of containers running that are the various different services that make up both, GitHub, the Git server and GitHub Pages and issues and all of that, as well as all the GitHub Action services and a variety of others. The other big thing we talked about is the growth on GitHub Actions has been astronomical. I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of repos using it. And, as of, I think May, whenever Satellite was, GitHub Actions, based on the data we can see, is the number one CI service on GitHub. We have more repos than pretty much anybody else that we can track. There's obviously lots of CI that might be happening that we can't easily see, but certainly from like the cloud service kind of thing, we're the largest, which we think is great and continues to grow. And we're excited to see what interesting things people do with Actions.
Well, it seems like there's zero friction in just having your build run. And like in the pull request workflow, it's just a checkbox to say, automatically run it. And if your build is in some type of script file anyway, then you don't even have to do anything other than, hey, run this script file. Which a lot of projects already have a build script that's just a file. Yeah,
definitely onboarding and seamless integration is something that we're working towards. I think we have a good experience overall. If you kind of look at Twitter or other sorts of anecdotal community information, people definitely seem to be excited. And overall, we think it's a pretty good getting started story. I think we can always make it better. We are definitely always looking at ways we can improve things like repo detection to better understand what kind of project is there and better offer a template that we think might work for you in a lot of those cases. Right now, everything is kind of based on the language. We have some things coming that we think will make it even better. We also want to make sure that that's kind of the individual project open source community model. That other side of things that we look at is not just CI, but other kinds of workflows. And if I look across what people do on GitHub Actions, there's a lot of people that do CI, but there's also a lot of people that use it to triage issues. There's lots of actions in the marketplace that do things like issue triage or pull request triage, or I've got people that are doing deployment workflows with GitHub Actions in really interesting ways that I may not have thought about before. We've seen some people do some interesting automated testing type workflows with GitHub Actions. And one of the things that we really are very excited about the future is we have built a platform that, while it has a great workload for CI, we think we can do a lot more with it. And just based on the fact that we listen to half a dozen or almost a dozen different events within GitHub, things like issues being created and issues being commented on and branches being created and all of those different things, you just have the ability to do so much more with GitHub Actions. I've been working on CI tooling for a really long time, actually, since about 2011, when I took over what was the XAML build system in TFS. And a lot of, it was always a common request, actually, in the TFS days. People said, why can't I run a build when something happens on a work item? And with Actions, we said, hey, let's make sure we have this generic thing called a workflow and a workflow run. And we have all these events. And there's nothing called a build. And that's by design, because we want people to think beyond those kinds of things. Even though people would use the quote build system that I've built in the past to do lots of other things, it was always a little weird because it's called a build. Well, now we just have this workflow, and workflows validate things or automate things for you.
So it's really meant to be a general purpose orchestrator.
To some degree, yes. It is meant to be a general purpose workflow orchestrator for GitHub. It's got the context of GitHub. It has all the events. And we have definitely done certain things. Primarily, the thing that we've done that I think leans it towards CI is the class of compute we use. So right now, we have sort of one class of VM-based compute. Over time, we expect to offer different classes of compute for different problems. So, for example, obviously larger VMs to make CI even better for larger projects. But the other side of things we'd like to do is imagine if you had this workflow and you could push an action in that was really just a Lambda function that we just ran in like a real serverless way, but had like instant response. Instead of waiting, the VM spin up pretty fast, but there's 10 or 15 seconds usually of spin up time. But imagine if it was just instant, like it was really a function, and you could string together these function calls for some of those automation scenarios where I don't need to sync the repo. I don't need all that information. Really, I just need the context of the event, and I want to do something and maybe add some labels to an issue or something like that. We think there's definitely some incredibly cool things we can do as we go forward, and it's absolutely things we're looking at.
Wow. Man, the juices are just flowing now. What things you could do. It makes me somehow think of a Zapier and Microsoft Flow, and because there's so many things that you need connectors. You need to integrate with different things. What's the strategy there?
Well, I mean, the strategy is an action. So we have this generic model of creating a thing that can run. You write it in JavaScript or you write it as a Docker container, and it can do whatever you need it to do. I think the key thing that maybe Zapier and Flow have solved that we haven't really got a great story for yet is how to deal with credentials and connections to other services. Right now, you need to have token-based or some other sort of long-lived key. We've got some ideas on things we can do to improve that. We'll see. Just keep an eye out for the changelog and other things as we go into the future.
Changelog. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so if you look at the GitHub blog, there is a changelog section that every time we ship something, we put it there. It's a little blurb about what the feature was. You can subscribe to it with an RSS reader to kind of keep up to date on what's going on at GitHub. Actually, right now, that changelog is paused and has been. And the reason we did that is we wanted to, with all of the things that are currently going on in the world, we sort of wanted to create some space for community conversation that wasn't about what's the latest change on GitHub. So we made a conscious choice to sort of pause some of our feature development communication and allow for the blog posts and the other messages coming from our leadership to kind of have some room to have a conversation.
So just going forward, you mentioned that we got this general workflow and it could be triggered on all kinds of events. Is there ways to plug in additional events that user-defined events? Is there any type of concept, or where is GitHub Actions going? What's not there now, but it's, behind, when you have your own team vision discussions, what's this is the way it should be. 10 years from now, this is going to be normal.
Oh, 10 years from now. I don't know if I could think that far to this. 6 months is a stretch for me. So we have a couple of things that you can do. First off, to answer your specific question about events, we actually do have a generic event called repository dispatch, where you can, and you can go look this up on the GitHub documentation. Essentially, you can have a custom payload, and you can fire this event into your repository, and you can have an Actions workflow trigger off it. And we've seen lots of people do cool things with that. So this is sort of the way that anybody can create an event with their own custom payload that triggers GitHub Actions. So you give it an event type, so whatever you want to call it, it's just a string, and then a JSON payload. But really thinking out into the future, we have a couple of big things that we are looking at in the near term, and then some things I really can't talk about yet for the longer term. One of the big things that we hear from our customers, specifically, this is I'll term them enterprise customers. I don't love that term, but most people understand it, and so we'll use it, is the ability to do better, more compliant continuous delivery workflows. So if you're familiar with Azure DevOps, as I assume most of your listeners are, you have this idea of environments and a pipeline with manual approvals and other types of gates that you can put in place to sort of gate that promotion of some artifact or some application from, say, QA to staging to production. And you can kind of do this with GitHub Actions, but we don't really have some of those controls in place yet. However, we really are working to make sure that's possible, and bringing the idea of basic manual gating and automated gating and other kinds of approvals and that idea of a pipeline promotion into GitHub Actions to really round out some of those continuous delivery scenarios. So that's really going to be a lot of the focus for the second half of this year. Sort of the first half of this year with GitHub Enterprise Server. Second half of this year is those enterprise continuous delivery scenarios. We have a lot of other stuff we're working on that I just really can't wait to talk about, but I really just can't do that quite yet. One of the things I am actually looking forward to, which is really more of a GitHub thing than GitHub Actions, is we've been working really hard to provide a process for teams to better share and have a conversation about the roadmap with the public. This is something you should keep an eye out for. I don't know exactly when it's going to come out yet, but having a real public roadmap with this is what we're thinking about doing, this is where we're going, and a way to have a conversation with the community about it is something that I'm super excited about. I can't wait to see.
Okay. When you talk about the architecture of Actions as a workflow orchestrator, that sounds like just a brilliant vision for the architecture, because then you don't paint yourself into a corner. It can support anything in the future, and then you layer on I think it's probably the common continuous or the common DevOps model, which is you have build things, you create this release candidate. Now you take this release candidate and you push it to a series of environments, and this is for applications, not open source libraries, but once it goes through a series of environments, you do some testing, you record that, and then you go to production. And so there's kind of like a common DevOps chain, and the architecture of Actions can support all of that. But then there's, I guess, some type of bridge that has to be built. Who's going to do that? Does it the application team? Does it need to be Azure?
Well, it depends on what you mean by a bridge. I mean, the idea of having a way to influence the orchestration to require certain checks, if you will, to happen, whether it's a manual approval or even, things like go and check some performance counters or other kinds of telemetry before you let this thing move from one environment to the other. That's going to be a core feature. That gating capability is going to be a core feature of Actions. It, like everything else with GitHub, we expect to have events and APIs relative to that, so people can plug in other things. So it might make sense for Azure to plug in something, or Amazon to plug in sort of something, whether it's CloudWatch or Azure Monitor or something like that, into that process to make it really easy for somebody to utilize those metrics or those types of things as part of their automated gating process. So GitHub Actions is definitely a platform which will have these core capabilities. We'll have built-in things like manual approval, probably is definitely a candidate to be completely built in, because in the end, you want to do approvals based on users typically, and those users are GitHub users. And so it doesn't make sense to have some external thing doing it. It really just needs to be GitHub. But the way that thing plugs in will be a publicly available interface that other things can hook into to do that kind of gating. And that's really building out that first class sort of continuous delivery model within GitHub. Over time, there's also other interesting models that we're looking at. Another big popular thing, probably more with the cloud native community than anything else, is this GitOps model, where what you really have is you have pull requests that move, say, YAML manifests from one branch to another or from one repo to another. And then you've got, interesting tools in Kubernetes like Argo and Flux that kind of pick those up and do this desired state thing. We're looking at ways we can participate in those communities and the ways we can provide the appropriate plug-in points and the appropriate capabilities and actions to allow you to get a really great visualization and some of those really nice experiences, even if you're not necessarily using kind of what I term the basic push model of deployment for technologies where that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This might not be Actions or this may GitHub, but there's a couple of common questions that you might be just the perfect person to answer them. But and this is Azure pipelines too. It's an issue. Somebody the hosted, is it called hosted build agents in GitHub? I know you're kind of using the similar machine
similar
banks.
term. We call them GitHub hosted runners and self-hosted runners.
Okay, so if the hosted runners don't have a dependency that's needed for the build process, you can fall back into a self-hosted. But some of the ones you're like, man, this is such a small dependency. I really don't want to do a self-hosted runner, like installing a custom font we have several clients that have a Microsoft Access dependency for some edge of the system. It's like, I just need to install the Access runtime. It's a chocolatey script, Mm-hmm. Is that a pattern where that's being worked on to try to make it easy to not have to fall back to a self-hosted, or is that not really part of the purview of the team?
We have some thoughts of things we'd like to do there. In the end, there's the challenge always boils down to, it's like we can't necessarily have everything of every version, because not everything's side by side very well, which is a big issue, particularly with things like Office components. They just don't side by side. So we have a pretty solid pattern of you run as administrator on all of our hosted runners, and so you can install what you need. So to some degree, we talk to teams and basically say, can you make a choice? Like in some cases, let's say that install takes 2 minutes. Well, maybe it's worth 2 minutes in every pipeline just to save the overhead of managing your own stuff. And so that's kind of a trade-off teams make. So if they can install it in line and they feel like the amount of time to do so is reasonable, then just install it in line, and that's fine. I think in the long future, the ability to have custom images for runners and things like that could be very interesting. There's a lot of complexity in doing that and doing that well. We'll see. I don't have anything specific, but it's definitely a conversation we've had to sort of make it, kind of a model where you would go and say, well, can I run a workflow that customizes the image and then just saves off, like you start with our image, you install some stuff, and then you somehow save that off, and then we reuse that image for your runners. I think there could be some interesting things we could do there. Like I said, I don't have any hard plans for that, but it's certainly something we've batted around in various different forums and brainstorming and things like that.
Yeah, there's no way that you could provide a solution, this magic set of dependencies that works for everybody. That's just a losing game.
Yes, it's very hard.
We had Elton Stoneman, who used to work for GitHub, on the show just recently again, and he was mentioning just a workflow with Docker where just doing, because you can save a new a new container image in a container registry. I wonder if that's if that's the flexible architecture where it's like, hey, here's the container that's the base, effectively the base image, and now you maintain your own derived container, but hey, we'll use your container to run on a hosted. I don't know.
Yeah,
that's probably a few years out, huh?
You can certainly do that today. We have features built into the pipeline that lets you specify your own container image to run your job. The plus side of that is it's a container image. You can control it. The downside is depending on how big that container image, that could take a while to download. Mm-hmm. So, the same kind of thing would hold true of how can we provide a way to cache those layers in a safe and secure way, because we can't rely on that container boundary as a security boundary. That's just not a thing. Not for multi-tenant. It just isn't sufficient.
Yeah.
But maybe there's a way that we can do something that says, well, using containers, we can attach storage and cache container layers or something like that. I don't know. We'll see. I think there's a bunch of different options. We've tried a few things. They don't always work as well as you like. Individually, they seem to work fine, but at scale, there tends to be more challenges than it's definitely something I deal with a lot. It's people like, well, hey, I set up my self-hosted runner in this way and it works great. I'm like, okay, it's an N of 1, right? If I'm looking at an N of 40 million, like it's a different world. So
yeah, fair enough. So awesome. Well, you talked about some of the new features of GitHub Actions. Is that all consuming for you, or what's next for Chris Patterson?
For right now, GitHub Actions is pretty consuming. Like I said, I have the stuff we're doing directly with GitHub Actions, and then I am looking further out in the future. I've got some projects that I've been working on with a few other teams that I think will be super exciting that I'm just not ready to talk about right now. They are related to Actions, but they're definitely further out. They're the year plus kind of things that you sort of have to get started on in order to really think about shipping.
Mm-hmm.
So it's exciting. I've enjoyed it. It's the CI/CD workflow automation area is always fun because everybody comes up with new stuff that I've never seen before. I mean, it's one of the few areas in development where you talk about polyglot sort of developers. I see everything. I don't know everything for sure, but boy, I see forum posts and Twitter messages and all of those things about every possible language or platform. And I have to at least consider it and learn a little bit about it and think a little bit about it, or go find the experts on it to help me understand how I should think about this thing. So it's definitely very exciting.
That's pretty cool. What is there one that pops to your mind about, man, I didn't know that they were doing that. Really? That language? Really? That platform?
Let's see. I don't know. I mean, Rust is a big one that I just didn't know a lot about until recently. And obviously a lot of people do. It's not a small one by any means, but it's out there. What's another one? The one that I hear more often than I thought I would is Power Systems. Like I run into people trying to do stuff with IBM Power Systems all the time. And unfortunately, we do not have great support for that right now because .NET Core doesn't have great support for it. But we're hoping that comes in the future, or we'll figure out some way of dealing with that. But yeah, it's interesting to see. And honestly, the weird thing about it is it's not just enterprises. So you would think that it would only be enterprises, but I talk to open source projects all the time that are doing ARM stuff or even Power Systems or like expanding their platform support. And it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. And the COBOL, I know COBOL, all that stuff was bought by Micro Focus, and then Hewlett Packard bought Micro Focus to get all the COBOL stuff, and there's still tons of those systems coming out. And that ecosystem has actually been pretty impressive. They've gotten bridges over to SQL Server. They've gotten bridges over to called .NET assemblies. That ecosystem is still kicking.
Yeah, it's one that, again, I don't deal with a lot. I have seen it in the past, but there are tens of millions of lines of COBOL that run maybe trillions of dollars worth of business. in this world, and you're just not rewriting that stuff. I mean, anybody who's been on a rewrite project knows how hard that is and how easy it is to make a mistake. And if you've got systems that are doing things that you just can't make mistakes, that's something to consider. I mean, COBOL's a fun one. I have some friends that do COBOL. They work in banks and stuff, and the thing they talk about, which is interesting, they said there's nothing. If you need to do batch jobs that process millions or billions of records in batch every day, there just frankly isn't a system that's better for it. Like the way the language sets up, the way the runtimes work. If you try to do that with SQL, you can, but you have to be really careful. But man, COBOL the way the language sets up and the way the underlying platforms work, apparently it just does it and just chews through that data. It's built for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And even to this day, the green screen UI format, there was a level of brilliance for that. We're just with the tabbing through and keeping hands on a keyboard or the number key and not even having to use a mouse, like an entire GUI, super fast. And you don't even have to reach for the mouse. If you walk into some lumber yards or some auto mechanic shops that still use the green screen style, those UIs are fast.
Yeah. I don't know. Even look at just whenever you're at the airport. Sure, that machine there is a PC, but they're running a VT100 emulator in it, basically.
Yes.
And everything's on the keyboard. I mean, it's fascinating because as developers, we tend to pride ourselves on not using the mouse. Like if you go to like real nerds,
oh yeah,
the big thing is we don't use the mouse. And the real people that don't use a mouse are all those people that just couldn't, and they can fly. I mean, you see somebody that's great at those data entry style or these kinds of systems, and the number of keyboard shortcuts, commands, things like that they used to go through is astronomical. It's amazing.
Yeah, and now we're into user interface design, because if you're designing an interface for productivity, that's one of the rules of thumb. Don't make them switch input devices, mouse to keyboard, mouse to keyboard.
Yep, that's right.
All right, now we're into a different show. Well, hey, I appreciate you coming on and giving us the update on what's going on in GitHub and with GitHub Actions. I know a lot of listeners are keeping a close ear to the ground there, and a lot of them are adopting it and getting their own action. Do we call it action pipelines or series of actions?
So the terminology to use is the product is GitHub Actions. And it is really named for the reuse aspect. So the individual things that you see in the marketplace or the repos, those are themselves are actions. It's the bit of code that runs. You build a workflow. We call it a workflow file. That's what the YAML file is, that strings together a set of actions. And whenever that is, so you have a workflow. And then whenever one of those is triggered, you get a workflow run. So you have a workflow run, and that is made up of actions.
And for a business application, do you typically have one workflow or a series of workflows?
Oh, I think it depends. I definitely see a lot of people with multiple workflows, and there's just different scenarios. So people have workflows for pull requests and workflows for CI, and maybe they have a workflow for issue triaging. It's definitely very, very common to have more than one workflow.
Cool. All right. Well, Chris, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Jeffrey.
And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.